think I have now. Yeah, so we're going to go through pretty much the structure of the dissertation, or the thesis, which there's not much difference in the two, to be honest. So we're going to go through the structure of why it's sort of shaped in the way it is, how to form your question, how to structure the report, how to develop your hypotheses, a little bit of how to do your literature review, and then how to format your research piece, if that's going to be an experiment or a case study. We'll talk a little bit about questionnaires. In fact, if I just go to the next slide, this is all written on the screen. We'll have a look a little bit about questionnaires and quantitative and qualitative research, and then we'll talk about how you should be analysing it, some little things you should do just to get the points, really, and then how you contextualise it and the all. Now, the important thing here to remember is your dissertation is not about the subject you're writing about. It's about the format and the process you go through to write it. Right? In our marking schedule, there is no marking. There is no points for how good engineering did you talk about. There is no points for it. Okay. There's no points for how well you talked about construction, engineering, mechanical, whatever it is. What there is lots of points for how you presented it, the context you presented the report in, how did you analyse it, how did you talk about your subject. So your subject itself is just a mechanism for you to go through a process, and it's the process you get the points for, not the topic. Right? And that's really important for you to remember, because lots of people last year wrote me a really lovely essay, but it had no process in it. They got really bad points. Okay, and the one or two who got really good points is because they followed the process. Okay, because we can't give you marks if you don't meet the marking schedule, and the marking schedule is all about a dissertation process, not about the dissertation subject. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the background on it. Our whole thing is set up to help you meet the engineering standards at the end of the report. Okay, so your logbook has all been aimed about this part. Really, your dissertation is only really looking at A and C, really, and them parts. And really, you'll hit them as long as you follow the process for doing your dissertation. Okay, so it's about developing that knowledge and the terminology and understanding the topic and how you communicate it. Right. But there is some elements of developing your IEng piece within the dissertation. So I've sort of presented it that there just to remind you that is one of the things. But when you write in the dissertation, it's an academic piece of work. You're not writing a report for the military. In fact, if you write it in the mannerism, you write a report for the military, you'll get really low points. Okay, because it scores really badly on the marking schedule. So you have to write it as an academic essay you are writing to deliver to an academic person, right? And we need it done that way because when we present it to the PATSAB and they get reviewed, the reviewer will read it. He's an external academic who has nothing to do with the military. Okay. You all have to understand as well where it fits in education. So this is Bloom's technology, and it's based on how you understand. So level 3 engineering, the stuff you did on your A1, that was remember and understand, and that's sort of what we introduced you to on the first year of your course. Into the second year, we started taking you from understanding it to applying it, and then we took you from apply to analyse, and that is pretty much where your dissertation stops. We're taking you really between analyse and a little bit of evaluate, but above evaluate and create, that's master's level. Okay, so that's where we're taking you to. We're taking you from that apply into analyse, and that's where you're showing us that you can apply this analysing process to the piece of research, the topic you picked. And as you can see there on the right hand side, as you go up the qualification level, you go further up the pyramid, and on the left hand side, further up the pyramid, less teaching we do, less instructing you get, less coaching you get, more mentoring you get. Okay, and that's really a bit about what we're doing today. Okay, so higher up the education level, less we actually tell you what to do, and we just sort of mentor you and point you in the right direction. And that's a big piece in your dissertation, is no one's going to tell you what to write. What we're going to tell you is the format to write it in, the mechanism to go through, and we'll give you some hints and suggestions, and you can use those as sounding boards, but we can't tell you what to write. Okay, so that's a big piece. To get good marks, you need to be hitting this analysing and slightly moving into the evaluate, but evaluate is then moving, is really master's level. What we're going to look at is forming your question. I know you all probably writing your proposals, your plans at this moment in time for your because they're due in at the end of the month. So what you've got to be really careful of in your titles is picking a huge subject, right? It actually will make it really difficult to write your dissertation. So what you want to do is pick an area study and narrow it in right to a specific point, which you can then test and adjust on. Okay. So the way we recommend you do it is you pick your subject, your wider area you want to look at. Are you looking at modular? Are you looking at sustainability? Are you looking at supply chains? Are you looking at energy management? Which area you're looking at? So you pick that big sky thinking topic. Okay. You then select an element of that topic. Is it the resourcing with it? Is it water management, transport? Are you picking a specific element within that wider subject you've just done? So you're bringing it down, okay? So you can't look at the whole topic. You haven't got enough words. In a dissertation, you need to narrow it right down. You're then going to contextualize it. Where are you looking at it? Don't try and look at it across the world. It's too big a subject. You'll get score really bad points on the contextualization, okay? Where are you looking at? Is it a set region? Is it the UK? Is it Asia? Is it exactly only offsite you're looking at? Is it only the temporary works element you're looking at? Is it just the supply and installation element of electrics you're looking at? Which way are you going to look at it? You then also got to sort of contextualize it with, are you looking at it in a military framework or a non-military framework? Because if you say you're looking at it in a military framework and then you don't bring all the things what come with being in the military with it, your research is pointless because you've looked at it in the industry context and it doesn't work in the military context. So if you haven't brought the resourcing elements of the military into it, you haven't brought the skill to training elements of the military in it, and actual operational requirements over what you're looking at. We don't do enduring warfare anymore. It's not part of the British Army's mandate. So if your topic is great, but it only works for enduring warfare, you can look at it in that way, but in your analysing, you're going to discount the whole piece of research because what you're going to say is it doesn't work in the framework that the British Army is now working in. Okay, so you have to contextualise it when you're looking at it. So you're looking at your question, you've picked the big topic, you've picked an area, you've narrowed it down in the part of the world and the discipline you're looking at it in. And then you use that to form your question. Okay, what do I actually want to know in that piece now? I've narrowed it down. Okay. So here's an example. Do you want to know, is water management and infrastructure going to reduce flooding? Okay, if I design my drainage better, will that reduce my flooding? Is that actually what I want to know? Okay, so we've looked at that big subject and we've slowly narrowed it down. We've put a bit of context to it. And then we've asked ourselves, what do we actually want to know in that little bracket? And that's what we're going to ask a question about. So an example of that is two different really ways you can do it. You can proper hammer your question. So here's an example. An analysis of how the incorporation of a circular economy approach could provide a sustainable solution to construction site waste in the first world regions. Okay, so when I've said first world regions, what I've done is married that now to Africa, right, or the Middle East. And in my first introductory paragraph, I'm going to say which one of them I'm going to look at. Okay. Or you can look at it slightly more wider sentence, giving it a little bit more vagary of the effects of the housing stock on the UK's 2050 sustainable energy goals. Right, I'm looking at exactly at the UK. I'm looking at exactly the 2050 sustainable energy goals. Okay, and I'm looking at the UK housing stock. So I proper narrowed down my field there. Okay, so when you're doing your question, and it's really important because at the end of your essay, you're going to answer your question. Okay, at the end of the dissertation, at the end of the thesis, you're going to answer your question. Was it right, or will it or won't it? So you have to proper understand what your question is to focus your research, your analyzation, and your final conclusion section of your report. And you need to incorporate that will then start helping you generate your structure. So here's an example. How do we define the question? Can I, with any help, throw one of these rocks into the pond? Okay. But then gather some information. So we're going to go out. So we picked his question. Can he throw that rock into the pond? He's now going to go and gather some information. And this is what you sort of do before your literature review. Okay, I go and gather that information, go and read some different areas, give myself an understanding. And then when you have that understanding, you're going to ask yourself a hypothesis. So can I throw that rock into the pond without any help? That's the question. But what I'm going to say is if I throw this rock so really hard, you won't believe it, it will go in the pond. So I've asked myself a question within the question. I've sort of made a statement. If I do this, this will happen and I'll achieve that question. And we'll look more at the hypothesis in a second. You'll then write about your research and you'll perform your experiment. So when you do your research, you're going to identify a gap in the existing research, and then you're going to go at that. It forms part of your hypothesis, and then you're going to conduct an experiment or look at case studies or do something to try and analyze, collect data you can then analyze to try and answer your question. Once you've got that data, you're going to analyze it. Right, you're going to draw conclusions out of it. You're then going to write that all up in your report. Right, and if you've got opportunity to get your in-unit mentor or before the submission deadline, come and get one of us to have a look at it. Right, but be aware if you submit a whole report to us, it's a submission. So send us bits of the report. Don't send us the whole report. Okay, and get us to read through it and say actually it makes sense. Yes, you're on the right line. Okay. So let's have a look a bit more about how we structure that. So what you're going to do is go through this process pretty much. You're going to go through an analytic process of looking at what you want to do, set yourself some objectives, and we'll talk about them in a second as well, really setting your objectives, which sort of roadmap out how your report's going to go. You're then going to collect some empirical data, and you're going to conduct a literature review. So you're going to read about loads of literature, stuff you can write in your literature review. You're going to look at drivers and barriers. You've got to look at the pros and cons of the subject. You can't just all go, yes, it's great. You've got to look at the bad points as well. And then you can collect some empirical data, be that by questionnaires, experiment, or looking at case studies. You're going to set some themes in how you're going to collect data from that empirical data. So what you're going to take from it. You're then going to review it and do some analysis to it. Review your map and themes you've looked at, and review that and summarize it, and then you're going to interpret all that data at the bottom with a comparison of your data against your literature review findings to make and answer your question and your hypothesis at the bottom. Okay, so to just put a bit of a structure to that, what you're going to do in your reports, you're going to write an abstract. That's the last thing you will do. Write the whole report, then go back and write the abstract. But it's the first part of the report what's to get read. You're then going to write your introduction. And your introduction chapter is really the background to your subject. A couple of paragraphs on it. Don't spend too many words looking at the background. Just introduce your subject. This is where you're going to set your context as well. What environment are you looking at it in? Is it a military environment? Is it an industry environment? Is it in the UK? Is it in the Western, in the Middle East? Is it in Africa? Where are you looking at it? Okay, put that in your background and contextualize your area. You're then going to propose your hypothesis to meet what you think is going to, your general statement of what you think is going to meet the question. And we're going to talk about hypotheses again in a minute, and they're totally separate from this one. This is a hypothesis, a statement on what you think if we review it, it will answer your question. Okay, so it's a statement. You're then going to set yourself some aims and objectives, and we'll talk about them in a second. right? And then you're going to have a paragraph on the bottom of that really saying how that all comes together and how you're going to focus it in what you're about to do. And then you focus, you're going to talk us about the next stepping stones, what you're going to do next. You're going to focus it within a literature review. You're going to talk about the methodology of the research you're going to do. You're then going to do it. You're going to analyze it. You can conclude it. All right. So when you focus, you're sort of just bringing it together of what the structure of your report is. You're then going to do a literature review. The next chapter is going to be your literature review. And you're going to look at both the barriers and drivers to your subject, to your question. All right. You're going to go through the core topics. And then at the bottom, you're going to summarize it all. And you're going to identify a research gap. And at no point in any literature review are you going to analyze anything. You're just going to state what research you found and what that research says. Right. You are not analyzing anything in your literature review. It is just they've read these things and this is what they say on both sides of the argument, right? And it tells you, and you need to do it in a flow that it goes through like a story as you go through the literature review. So it's not just big cut and paste chunks from all over the place in there. It needs to follow a story to get to your summary, summarize it and identify the research gap. And you need to reference it to death. Right, you need to use referencing. There's so many points within the marking schedule for referencing, and if you don't reference, you will lose a huge chunk of points. And it needs to be done to the Harvard referencing system. So if you don't know how to do that, go on the internet, Google it. There's some really good little tools on there that help you do it. If you set up your Word document right, your Word document will do it for you. Okay, right. So make sure you get in there, you set that up, and you tell us that story of your research. Pros and cons, but you're not conducting any analyzation. You are just presenting the findings of the stuff you've read. You're then going to tell us how you're going to do your empirical data collection. All right, so you're going to talk about the methodology. Are you going to do a questionnaires? Are you going to do an experiment? Are you going to review secondary data in case studies? Which approach are you going to your research strategy? So you've read about the topic, you're now going to do your own bit of research to look at the gap in research you've just identified. Okay, so are you just going to compare a load of case studies where people have researched it before to see if there's a running trend throughout all case studies what prove which address the gap, right, and answer your question? Or are you going to do a little experiment based on a project you're doing, and you're going to run a little experiment, and the findings from that you're then going to compare against your literature review to see information to see if there's a running trend or you've proved a point in it. All right. Or you're going to ask lots of directed questionnaires, and we'll talk more about questionnaires in a minute because you have to be careful with them or they become pointless. Right. And target information to try and get points of view, either qualitative or quantitative, in the way you go through to collect your data. Okay, so you talk about the methodology at the top, and then you go into the methods on how you're going to do it. So you say, I'm going to use, let's say you're going to say you're going to use a questionnaire. I'm going to use a questionnaire targeted at this area of the industry. I'm going to look at addressing people between this age group. To try and see what this part of the industry at this age group think that this part of it is to understand the trend analysis. I'm going to do that. In the methodology, you're then going to talk about how you're going to do the questionnaires, what questions you're going to ask, why you're asking them questions, what you're aiming to achieve by asking that questions, how you're going to record, what you're going to do with the data when it comes in. Are you going to put it into tables? Are you going to do this with it? And you're literally going to talk us through how you're going to do that piece of the research, that experiment, and how you're going to present the data. You're not going to analyze it in that section. You're just going to tell us how you're presenting the data, talking us through the process. Okay. And you've done that, you're then going to present the empirical data. So the methodology you've just done, you carry that out, and then you present in the data in the way you've just told us you're going to do it. Okay, so you present that data in, put it into the report, and you're just going to tell us what it is. 25 people from this age group reported this in the survey, which collated as this following information. That 27 people said this. Are you just going to go through that process in the empirical data and display the data, put some fancy charts in, show it all, right, and show the data. Then in chapter 6, you're going to review it. This is where you analyze it. You're going to go back into that data. You're going to analyze what you think it's saying. You're going to compare it to your literature review, right? and you're going to see if it confirms following findings you've seen, and you're going to compare all that data together. Okay, is it following a trend? Is your data totally the opposite to what it says in the literature review, or does it get confirmed by other people's research? That's what you're going to do. This is where all your analysis happens, is this section, all right? And you're going to come out with some conclusions and some evaluations. This is where you're going to see if you're meeting your objectives and your hypothesis. And then finally, you're going to conclude the report. And your conclusion is the whole process. It's not your findings. Your findings was in chapter 6. Your conclusion is throughout the process, this is what we have found. And in answer to my question, yes, this can be done, or no, it can't be done. Right? You're concluding the process. You are not just reiterating your findings. Okay, so you're going back to your question and you're saying, did my research, a literature review, and my experiment, and my findings prove or disprove the question? Okay, that's what you're saying in your conclusion. You're then going to say recommendations for further research. You're going to summarize it all up and give out the recommendations. So if you've looked at a really narrow area and you think actually there's extra areas on top of it what need to be looked at, then you can say that on top of the recommendations. So an example of that is you looked at cement replacement in reinforced concreting, but actually what you didn't talk about is how it affects the rebar, is the things you were going to replace with effective rebar, and how that might affect some of the durability in it. The future research, we need to look at the steel and the durability. Okay. So you need to go through that process within the structure of the report. Okay. So that's your structure. And what you're doing is you're going through this process within this structure of your report. Right? And if you do that in the methodology I've just told you to do it, you will hit a lot of points, right? Because you're following the process we need you to follow. Okay. And it's a standard academic process. Let's look at some of the things you can do now. Oh, and yeah, at the end, you need to put all your references in. And all the way through this report, you need to be referencing if you're doing your methodology. The reason you're taking that methodology, because such a body says in their literature, this is the best way to address this subject. Referenced, right? I'm using this methodology in my questionnaire because such a body said that's what I should be doing. Referenced, okay? Reference it to death. The only sections you don't reference is your conclusion and your findings, but the only references you'll put in your findings is referring back to your literature review and to your empirical data. So if you've quoted something in that empirical data, or you're quoting something in that literature review, you'll copy that reference down into your findings. But you don't put any references in your conclusions because you shouldn't be adding new information. Right, it's a conclusion of the project report. But all your references need to be in the bottom. And for this level of academia, if you should have nothing less than 20 references, at minimum 20 references. On average, a BN's dissertation is between 20 and 50 references at least. Okay, because you should be hammering your references all the way through your literature review, all the way through your methodology and your methods, right? And as well as probably in your introduction. Okay. So let's look at your hypothesis and your aims. Well, there's the stuff you're going to talk about in your introduction. So you're going to form a hypothesis based around your question. So you set your question, you've narrowed down right into the area, and what you're going to say is this approach, doing this will cause this, right? Which will answer my question. Okay, so a circular approach will reduce waste in construction. I've stated it. That is my hypothesis. Okay, I have stated that as if it's fact, right? And you're going to prove or disprove that hypothesis in your research. So you formed your question. You're then going to state an hypothesis on it. This is fact. I'm done. This is going to happen. Because in your conclusion and in your findings and in your conclusion, you're going to state if this fact's right or not, or you've proved it or disproved it. Okay. You're then going to set yourself a research aim. All right. The aim of this research is to understand the impacts of streamlined supply chain created by the use of recycling material recycling and material reuse will have on landfill and waste costs. Right, that's the aim of it. So I've stated my fact, and I'm going to put a research aim on that. You then gone set yourself some objectives for meeting this aim. Okay, all right, so meeting the aim, and these are your stepping stones throughout your report. Okay, and I'm going to show you these a little bit more in a second, but these are what you want to achieve in your literature report. These are what I want to achieve in my methodology. This is what I want to achieve in my findings, and this is what I achieve in my conclusion. So if you look at that, I want to identify blah, 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 blah about the topic. That is what I'm going to do in my literature review. I'm going to evaluate my research topic, my experiment, my case studies and that. That's the information you're going to find in there. I'm then going to explore the findings I get from that against my literature review. That's you explore. That's what you're going to do in your evaluation. And formulate, you're going to formulate further areas of research. Shitbust. That is what you're going to put in your conclusion. So these objectives are your stepping stones through your report. Right? You should be achieving an objective in each chapter. Okay. And so your literature review, your methodology, your findings, and your conclusion, your stepping stones to objectives. And at the end, you're going to say if you achieved them. Now, this is a breakdown of how I did my dissertation when I was doing it for my master's. Okay, but it's the same methodology. So you can see here at the top, I broke down my aims. There's the question. These was my aims. Okay, these were my objectives within my aim. So I'm going to identify barriers. I'm going to evaluate the shading. That's my experiment. I'm going to explore the appetites. That's my questionnaire. And I'm going to formulate recommendations for future research, which was placed in my conclusion. The bits I didn't research, which related to my topic. Okay. And then what I did is I looked at areas I was going to review within my project. So each one of these I broke out. Okay. I'm going to identify the barriers. How am I going to do that? I'm going to review doctrine, and I'm going to look at present strategies. How I'm going to understand energy savings. So that's part of my evaluate one. So I'm going to look at these different areas. My appetite to change. That's more about my third one, my exploring present appetites. So what am I going to look at in there is these areas, and then review my findings, and that's going to identify the gaps. Okay. So that's how I was achieving each one of my aims. And this is a good way of just writing it down, getting a pretty picture of what you're trying to do in your report, because you're giving yourself that structure. As you go through the process, you can write it all down. Right? And something like this, put in your project plan, hint, hint, will get you really good marks. So if you put something like this to show your workings within your project plan, you're going to get some good marks off it. Okay. So let's look at, now we've identified what we're going to do, because you're going to talk about this part in your introduction. You're going to say all these bits of what you're going to look at in your introduction, right? And then you're going to start doing it. So let's look at your literature review. So yeah, I'm going to identify which objectives to aim to answer in your literature review. And this is how we do it. We start big picture, and we slowly work down, narrowing the topic as we write about our literature review, looking at pros and cons of the topic area, right down to a point at the bottom, right? And when we get here, we say, actually, I haven't read anything about this. And that's the gap in the research. That's the bit I want to look at. All right. So it could be something you've read loads about. It could be, I'm just going to use my one, shading. I've read about loads of shading in architectural design. I've read about no shading, read no literature about shading in the military context. So he's read about loads of it in civil history, but I've read about none of it in the military. So I'm going to look at the same thing, but in a military setting, and see what impacts doing the same thing in the military will have. Okay, and that's where that contextualization piece you've mentioned in your first couple of paragraphs, I'm looking at it in a military context. When you look at this literature review, you can say there's loads of pros and cons about it, but I've read nothing about it in the military. All right, so I'm going to look at this subject, but in the military environment. And And when you're talking about this bigger picture, because you contextualized it in the military, you need to talk about the military in your literature review. You need to talk about some of the issues we have in the military, what makes us different from everyone else. All right. And the big ones that make us different is we normally build our project on the other side of the planet, where there's no materials, really bad logistics, and we're a poor skill set because we can't bring contractors in all the time. All right. That's the big thing, what makes us different from everyone else. We normally build shit where no one else wants to. Okay. And there's loads of issues that come with that. So something could be really sustainable in the UK may not be sustainable at all because of where we put it in the world and the supply chain it's taken to get it there. Okay, it could be the most sustainable modular building in the world, built and used in the UK. But when I've picked it up and I've shipped it around Africa, I've then moved it across Africa and flew it 200 miles, it's no longer sustainable because the embodied carbon in that transport is going to take 60 years to repay. Okay, and it's only got a 20-year lifespan. Right. That's the sort of contextualization you need to be talking about in your identifying in your literature review, because then you can compare it in your analysis. You can state it, you can use that as bringing out your points in your analysis. Okay. Oh, set it out in a logical flow to your chapter. Logically set it out. Break down your research into selected areas to counter your opinion as well as support it. Both sides of the fence. Okay. Look at your topic from different angles. I've looked at it from this angle, which is an industry. I'm not going to look at it from the military angle. There's not a lot of research on it. Okay. All right. Or there's a whole PAM on it. Talk about it, but it's looking at it from a different way. Okay. Or I've looked at it in the UK. Now let's look at it in Europe. Let's look at it in Africa and see how the different industries have put it in. Okay. Let's look at it in the US and Russia and the Middle East and see if it's different. Different parts of the world, why does it done different way? Has it had different effects? Have a look at that in your literature review. Don't analyze. This is not the part of your report where you analyze stuff. You are just presenting what you are finding. Okay. And make sure you reference everything. Everything you read, reference it. Everything you write in there, reference it. Do it to hybrid referencing, because if you don't, you're going to throw away about 30% of your points. Okay, because we won't be able to give them to you. And at the end of it, you're going to summarize, you're going to highlight the emergent issue and the research gap. The contextualization, you're going to look at something in. Okay, because if there's lots of research in there already in your area, don't pick that subject. Pick something else or put another twist on it that there isn't lots of research about. Because what you'll find is you'll end up going down plagiarism routes if you liked it or not. Because you'll state exactly what someone else has stated and you'll be practically plagiarizing them. So you've got to put a twist on it. You've got to make it your own. You've got to look at it from a different perspective. It needs to be a new area, even if it's only a slight twist on an area everyone else has hammered. And once you've done that, you've identified the area you're going to do your little experiment on. You're then going to look at quantitative. If you're going to look at how you're going to do your research, right? What's your empirical data coming from? Is it going to be qualitative or quantitative? Right? What's the difference? Well, quantitative data is more about numbers. You can only take one in 30, take a free ice cream. Interesting. Okay, it says it there on the screen. He's got numbers 1 in 30. Where qualitative data is more about getting more from that. Okay, how did you feel when you found that there was a free ice cream? I was excited. I was a little bit scared. I wanted the ice cream. Okay, it's not numbers to it. It's harder to analyze the data, but you can find out more from it. So when you're doing qualitative data, you've got to put a marking scheme against the type of answers you're getting, and there's also a bit of personal way of balance to how you're going to make sure that the factors what come out are not biased by yourselves or other things. And you have to talk about that in your methodology. How are you designing out the bias? Okay. And a way of looking at that is this sort of diagram on the screen here. Right. So you've got behavioural, right? You've got attitudinal, we've got qualitative on this side and quantitative on this side. Right. And we're looking at what people say here against what people do. So behavioral against what people's attitude thinks they are. Right. How many and how much? We're looking at numbers on this side. Right. Why and how do we fix it? We're looking at context, words on this side. Okay. And whichever approach you're going to be, wherever it sits on this diagram, you need to explain why you've gone down that way. Okay, why have you decided to take your data, your research down that different approach? And you need to explain that in your methodology. It could be just a paragraph or a couple of paragraphs explaining why you've decided which way you're going to do it, but you need to explain why you're doing it. And there's quite a lot of points against that. So what I've done is actually created a little product. I'm going to drop it on the ELE in a bit so you can grab it, right, to try and help you work out how you do an experiment, right, or how to do a case study. It's a little Excel document. But what I'm going to do is talk through some of the bits of it now. So if you're going to do an experiment, you're going to look at experimental data. Right, that's primary data analysis. You are doing something, the data come through it, you're the first person to see that data. Is primary data. Now, that's easy to do. If you want to do it, you pick yourself a test and do it. But you need to make sure that you've designed the experiment against experimental practices. Okay. And this table broke down to try and help you how to do that. So I'm just going to go through the different elements of it. Okay. So the first box is the question you picked. Put your question in there. Now, you may have picked a couple of little things within your big question of little questions you might want to answer to get data to go in a certain way. So yeah, you don't have to do it this way. When I did my masters, I picked 3 questions within my bigger question that I wanted to look at. Now that does make things complicated. So if you just want to keep it to one piece, just keep it to one piece and keep it nice and simple. Okay. But then what you're going to look at is your independent, your dependent, and your extraneous. And what they are is your independent is the thing you are going to change. Okay. It's the thing in the experiment you are going to adjust. So it could be, so my shading one, I was going to put something I was recording data against, a sensor in the shade. That's literally all I did. I put one sensor outside in the sun and one in the shade. The thing I changed was I put one of the sensors in the shade, a meter out from the surface of the building. Okay. What did I expect that to cause, which is the dependent? So the independent is the thing I've changed. The dependent is the effect I expect to get from that is to change the air temperature because it's in the shade. But within that experiment, what can't I change? What is I know is going to impact the experiment, which I have no effects on, which I know is going to happen. So what I knew was going to happen in this one is that the building would give off shortwave radiation, okay, which is coming from internal heat losses from the building. It's going to give off shortwave radiation. There's nothing I can do about that. But I can put a control measure in to try and reduce it. So all I did is I did the experiment in the middle of COVID when the heating was turned off. Okay, that allowed me to reduce the amount of shortwave radiation getting given off from the building. Okay, it may be that I built something and there was no shortwave radiation onto it. I just built my own thing and I put it somewhere out of the way so it was not getting any shortwave radiation. But when you're looking at your experiment, you set your question, you set what you're going to change in your experiment. Okay, you're going to say what you think it's going to achieve. Talk about what you can't affect, something what will affect your experiment, and what control measure you're going to put in place in it. That is you setting out the variables of your experiment. You're then going to have a hypothesis against that experiment. Now, this is not the hypothesis we talked about earlier on. That is the hypothesis for your whole report. This is your null hypothesis for the experiment you're doing. So the thing I've put in place, the effect I'm going to have, this is my hypothesis. Now, you can't prove a hypothesis in an experiment. You can only disprove them. Right. So your null hypothesis, your null hypothesis is the opposite to what you want it to do. Right. So my shading, the use of shading over a structure will not reduce the external temperatures. So I've said, I'm hoping that the shading will reduce it. What I've said is totally the opposite. That is your null hypothesis. It's the thing I want to disprove in the experiment. And your alternative hypothesis is the thing you actually want to happen. Okay, so your null hypothesis is the thing you don't want to happen. Your alternative hypothesis is the thing you want to happen. And you need to write them down because you're going to explain all these in your methodology. Okay, that's why we go through the sheet, because you're going to interpolate these points into your methodology. Okay, you're then going to look at how you're going to measure it. Okay, so what's your datum? How will you manipulate the independent variables to enable it to do it? Right, how are you going to measure that variable, and how you can control the outside factors? So we're now talking about the measurement piece within it. Okay, so if you're using sensors, I'm going to say I'm going to put a sensor here in this situation. I'm going to put a sensor here in this situation. That's how I've manipulated my independent variable. So one's in the sun and one isn't. Right, I'm going to monitor it for so many hours a day to see that I'm getting a recording in that period. Right, how am I going to measure it? Well, it's going to measure it in 10-minute intervals because that's what the sensor does. All right. But it could be you're doing it every couple of hours. It could be however works best for you. And then how are you controlling the outside factors of it? Are you going to put a fence around it? Are you going to put it in a place no one gets to? Right. What are you going to do to control that site so it doesn't get interfered with during your test flow piece? Okay. And what you're doing here is setting the parameters of your test as you go through it. And then the last one, you're going to look at the reliability of your data as you're bringing it in, right? And how you're going to validate it. Okay, so I've said here I'm going to record my sensors every 10 minutes, and every 48 hours I'm going to come in with an external sensor and check them, and I'm going to download all the results. Okay, so I don't lose them. And then I'm going to check before I use any sensors. I'm going to calibrate them for 12 hours before use to make sure that they're calibrated. Okay, so that's how I validated check the reliability of what's going on, and I validated the sensors. So when you're looking at your equipment, whichever way you're going to do an experiment, whatever it is, you need to go through this process and identify the different areas, and then explain all that in your methodology. So you could do this table, put it in as an annex, explain it though all in your methodology, and then you say, oh, and by the way, all that is in this is annex, but you have to put the words in the methodology. You can't just reference an annex, because your annexes get no marks. If it's not in the main document, we can't allocate marks to them. Annexes are just there to support everything else, but there's no marks against your annexes. Okay. If you're going to do that as a case study, we have to do it slightly different because it's secondary data, it's someone else's data. So what we have to look at is what your hypothesis, set your hypothesis again, right, your null hypothesis and your alternative one. Right, select what criteria you're going to look at. So I'm going to look at these case studies, right, and I'm going to look at it against these set criteria areas. So what I've done, I've made a little table. I'll give it you in the top here. You'll just write what you've got 6 areas. You can use as many as you want. And what you'll pick 6 different criteria in this example, and then you're going to score each one of them criteria 1 to 10. And in each one of these boxes, you would write what that meant. Okay, so what was 1 against that criteria? What is 10 against that criteria? So in every one of these boxes, you would write what that score means in that criteria. Okay, so if you're testing, I don't know, the strength of concrete, we could put it achieves 2 newtons all the way up to 70 newtons in the boxes, right? It gets better as the newtons get stronger. Right, then we could put the durability, how long it takes to cure, and we could go through all these different factors while we're looking at it. And I'm sure you can all think of different ways of doing that within your different ones. So you set your criteria, you're going to put what each one of these scores means. You're then going to look at your different case studies, right? And once you pick your criteria, you've got to justify why you've used that criteria. It may just be that's the advice given in this BS, or that's the advice given in this report to use the following criteria for this subject. It could be I've done this because I want to find out the following things about this subject. But you've got to justify your criteria once you've set it. You then got to go and look at all your case studies and pull the data out of them. So a good way of doing it is just make a chart, and I have made you a little chart. You can put your case studies across the top. You can put some areas down the left hand side, and then just start pulling things out of the case studies and just writing them into the boxes. This happened. It talks about this. It talks about this. It talks about this. It doesn't have to be related to your marking criteria. Just start pulling information out the report and put it into the table. Then you're going to assess all this data against this marking criteria, and you're going to start scoring each one of the reports. So these in this template are all drop downs, they're all 1 to 10s. So you can look at this marking schedule against each one of your case studies, and you can put a score against it, against this criteria. So you're collecting all that data. Once you've got all your numbers filled in here against your criteria, it will give you a total a score for that case study, but it'll also give you a total score for that area of assessment. So what you can do from this then is it'll give you also the percentages overall out of the total score so it'll give you a ranking, which one 1 to 10 pretty much. Okay. So that helps you to identify which case study met the best requirement, right? So if you're looking at different types of equipment, you can say, well, this one was the best because it got the highest score. And then you can conduct a comparison and record all them scores. You can see who's got the highest scores. What I would say is don't force it. Don't manipulate the scores to get the one you want. Just carry out the process, okay? And put the scores in the boxes, because you may find that the one you thought were the best doesn't come out the best against your criteria, all right? And don't force it, because it makes it so much easier to write it if you don't force it, okay? If it totally goes opposite to what you thought it was going to go, when you're writing up your findings, you can write it up so much easier if you didn't force it, because you can say, well, I thought this was going to happen, and that's what the literature said what was happening, but in my research, I found this happened instead. And it'll help you write your work a hell of a lot better if you don't force it, because it'll prop up things you didn't expect to happen, right? Which gives you something to write about. Then once you've got all these scores, right, and you've mentioned in your methodology what sort of charts you're going to use, how you're going to present your findings, put it in some fancy charts, show us what the data is saying, right, what the trends are, what things. It could be line diagrams, it could be block diagrams, whichever way you're going to do it, but present it in some fancy charts, right? Don't put any effects on it, just present it in the charts with some colors in, right? But don't put shading on it, don't put anything like that on it. Just put in a nice fancy charts to show how your data have done, right? And then start analysing your results against your literature review. Why did the findings come out the way they did? What does that mean against your question? Okay, start analysing it. Okay. And then the other things you can start looking at is questionnaires. Okay, so I put a QR code up at the top here. It'll take you to SurveyMonkey, and there's loads of information on SurveyMonkey about lots of different questionnaires. There's so many different types that I'm not even going to go and try and go into them. I've listed them all there on the left hand side. There's loads of different questionnaires you're going to do, can do. All right. But there's two types of questions you're going to ask, and you need to say what your questionnaire questions are going to be in your methodology. But you're going to ask open questions, you're going to ask closed questions. Open questions are, open questions, you can get any answer back from them. You're not going to get yes, no answers. So if you're trying to get more information, draw information out of people and find out where the conversation goes, or where the answers could go, that's what you're going to get from open questions. Actually, it's a right pain in the ass when you're doing research. Okay, right, but if you if you go into academics or you go into technical people or professional people and you want their opinion, you're probably going to ask more open questions to find out technically where they come and what that takes you. But if you're just trying to get yes, no answers, then you need to use closed questions. You can't just ask yes, no. You have to give them a get out. So you have to put don't know. You have to give them a third option, okay, which needs to be in the middle. So if you're going to ask a closed question, it needs to be yes, no, or non-applicable, or something like that. If you don't put that third option in, bin the question, right? Because it's pointless. We're not going to give you any marks for it, okay? Right? Because it's not an academic question. You force the answer one way or the other, right? So you need to put in a yes, no, and a third option. And then when you've got all your results back in, tally them up. Put them against your scoring mechanism, tally them all up, find out what the results are, okay? Because once you need to get that numbers, that data, so you can do some analysis to it, okay? If you do open questions, your analysis is a little bit more complicated because you've got to justify your answers, okay? Or your comments against the answers. Okay. When you're doing your survey, you need to justify that the amount of answers you've got back quantify a realistic piece of data against your question. If you put out 100 questionnaires and you get 3 back, the answers are not worth anything to you. Okay, so there is a calculation you can do. The link to it, as it explains, it's there from comes from SurveyMonkey, but it's an academic piece to do. Carry out this calculation and say what the population size of the amount of questionnaires you sent out that you need to get back for your data to hold any relevance. Okay, so there's how to do the calculation. Do that, show that calculation in your methodology, right, to say that the amount of questionnaires you've got back is it's actually worth the analysis. Okay, because if you don't, you'll get low marks on the questionnaire. Okay, because how do we know if the returns from them are worth the effort? So make sure you do that calculation if you're going to do a questionnaire. Also, when you do your questionnaires, justify who you're sending it to. Okay, if you're going to send it, just put it on LinkedIn and send it to the world. You have to justify why the people answering it, why the questions are relevant. If you're just going to send it to a technical group, like at 170 or someone, then you can say that actually I was targeting this audience and they're targeted them for this reason. Okay, which meant that the scores all come back will be slightly biased towards this opinion. All right. If you're just going to send it to a group of pregnant mothers, why are you sending it to a group of pregnant mothers? Okay. Are you sending it just to men? Are you sending it just to women? Are you sending it just to people in the UK? Are you sending it to a bigger people across the world? It justify the target group you're sending the questionnaire to. If you just shotgun it out and then don't justify why you've done that, again, you'll get lower marks on your survey because you haven't justified the target audience. Okay, right. And this is all part of that academic research piece. Right, you need to be able to justify why you've done things. And then when you've done it all, you need to do a little bit of analysis to it. Now, I'm not going to try and talk you through how to do all these questionnaires. What I'm going to do is I pointed a nice little video QR code on the bottom corner. There's a link I will put at the end of the presentation. Go on, watch the video, and this gentleman will tell you how to do statistical analysis very easily against the formulas you get pumped out of your numbers from either your questionnaires, your case studies, or your experiments. But what you have to do is prove your numbers statistically, right, to give them academic rigor. If you don't do it, we can't give you the full set of points. Okay, so you need to go in, look at your data and say, right, this data has been proven that actually academically it's relevant because I've carried out this test of it and it comes with this answer. Okay, so some of the most common ones are one called a chi-square test. We've got a thing called a t-test. We have one called a correlation test, and there's an Ananovia's test. Okay, they all have the different uses. This little diagram on the screen here sort of shows it to you. If you've got one category difference, then a simple proportion test is fine. If you've got 2 categories difference, so you've got males, adults, and elderly, adults and elderly, then you might want to do a chi-square test. If you've got 1 number difference, so you've looked at heights of people, tall and low and short, a t-test might be better. And as I said, watch the video. He explains it really easily on how to do it. There's just a couple of examples of how I did it within my master's dissertation. I wanted to compare students against engineers, so I actually got you lot to do a survey. I compared it. I got the tech update to the survey, and I compared the surveys. So students and people in practice, I compared them, and I used a for and against the topic, and I did a chi-square test. All right, to enable to prove that. I got some data from my test results, which were 2 lots of different data, and I just did a correlation test against them to see if there was any relevance to them in relation to each other. And then I had another one where I had lots of data, and when you do lots of data, it can look really pretty, but it can mean nothing. Okay, so what I did is what we call a t-test to prove that was a correlation in all the data at the different ranges, that there was a running theme going through them. It wasn't just I presented lots of it and I looked at the numbers and said, yes, there's a correlation. The t-test proved there was a correlation academically and statistically, sorry, that there was a relation between them. Okay. And when you've done all this lovely stuff, you've presented your results back, you're then going to analyze them. Right? And remember, it's against this system. You're going to show your results and then you're going to analyze them. Right? But you're not trying to create a new piece of research. You're analyzing it in the context you presented it and seeing what came out and then answering your question. Okay, so when you've done this, you're analyzing your data, you come out, you're then going to answer your hypothesis and say, the statement I said at the beginning, was that statement correct or wasn't it correct? And that's what your analysis is trying to prove or disprove. Okay, so follow through the process, compare your findings against your literature review, present what that comes up with, and at the end of it, you're pretty much going to say my hypothesis was right or it wasn't right. Okay. You don't want to go any higher than trying to evaluate. You are not trying to create a new piece of research. That is what we do at master's level. Okay, you were just evaluating a topic within a context you identified it has not been evaluated in before. Okay, and then you're going to sum up in your conclusion. Did you answer your question or didn't you answer your question? Okay, did the data, the process you went through, answer the question? If it didn't, and state it. I went through this process. This is my findings showed this. That showed that the answer to the question, the statement in my question couldn't happen or could happen. Okay, and then at the end you'll say what areas of research need doing and put all your references in. So just to summarize what we talked through, decide what your question and your approach is going to be. Build your template, write in all the headings. Okay, break out in your chapters. Look at your topic and put some subheadings in there. Use that as your structure to make the report. It'll help you write it. Okay. Conduct your research. Read some things, both sides of the argument. Look at it in different contexts. Okay. And then write that all into your literature review. Okay. Just present what you found. Don't analyze it. Just present it. Then when you've decided what you're going to look at and in what context, write your methodology, explaining what your empirical data is going to be, which methods you're going to go. Are you going to survey, experiment, case studies, which way you're going to go, how you're going to do it, and how you're going to present the findings. Once you've done that, write up your data and present it, then analyze it and write up the findings from that data backed up by your literature review information, then reflect on it in your conclusion to reflect on if you met the question and did you answer it, and then write in your references. Okay, and stuff like your limitations, your assumptions, right? Write all that into the conclusion. Did your assumptions come to tuition? If they didn't, state it. I assume this, and this. Actually, I found out in my results that them assumptions were correct. That had a negative impact on the question, and that proved that the question actually isn't relevant or can't be conducted, or my assumptions were correct. That supported my findings. They were supported in my findings, and that proved that the question and the hypotheses were correct, and this can be conducted. Okay, reflect on it, references, done. Any questions on that 60 minutes of me just talking non-stop?
I've got a question kind of relating to what you've gone through and kind of not. So the project plan, when we hand that in, if we then develop the question and change what we were going to do from the project plan, does that matter?
Not really. Okay. You've just got to justify in your conclusion why you went off plan. Okay.
So do you refer to your project plan in?
Yeah, so you could say that I originally wanted to look at this topic, but I found actually through going through my research and the literature review that actually there was a better gap analysis in this area, and that's why we went down that one instead.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, if you go off your project plan, it's not a major issue.
Okay, that's all right. Just because I've not really defined it yet, so.
But yeah, I went down a totally different concept in my master's dissertation than what I actually said I was going to do, because my research took me in a totally different direction and I ended up changing what I was doing.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's not an issue. But in your project plan, what you need to be talking about is what you think your question is, what you think your objective is, what your objective is going to be, what a methodology approach you're going to look at, pretty much the structure. So you're going to look at your literature review in these areas. These are a few references I've already looked at. Make sure you put some references in your project plan. There's points against it. Okay. This is the methodology I'm thinking of using. This is the sort of timelines I'm going to look at for doing my research. I'm going to engage with my mentors in unit and in out unit in these periods. Okay, this is areas I'm going to look at for possible future research. Done. Okay, because you haven't got a lot of words to smash in your project plan.
The only other question I've got is there somewhere where, if we decide to go towards something to do with the military, is there somewhere where reports and research is stored for military reports?
No, so in theory we should submit all your reports if they're related to the military to TICRA.
Yeah.
To add them to the research. A good place to find previous research is actually the core journal. Lots of people publish their dissertation findings in the core journal. Okay, so that's a good place to find them. But really, we don't have at the moment a good repository for past research. Okay, and we should really build one, to be honest. But TICRA is a good start. You could go to the institution. The institution does have a lot of previous research areas in topics. The museum may have stuff. There's actually weird and wonderful stuff in the museum archive. It's always worth asking him a question. And in the future, unfortunately, no, it's not going to be much benefit for you. All that will be tied together, but at the moment it isn't.
Yeah. Okay. That's all I've got at this point.
Anything else?
Casper, can you go back to the so where you're coming up with your question, the developing your question slide, please?
Get there eventually.
I couldn't have picked one further away, could I?
Yeah. Start with it.
Yeah. So you know where you say you go to your area of the world.
Yeah.
If I've already, so I've kind of like broke it down to, I'm looking solely at defence estates. Do I have to specify where?
You don't, but what you'll find is the context in defence estates in different parts of the world is different. So let me give you an example. You look at DIO. DIO and break themselves down into different areas. So you've got StratCon Command, who's the Falklands, the Ascension Islands, Gibraltar, and Cyprus, and a few other ones. They are run and managed in a total different way than the rest of the estate.
Let's say it serves part of my argument to sort of highlight the difference across the defence estates.
Okay. If that works in your benefit, that it is great. But the reason I say be careful with it is the supply chain in StratCon is totally different. The supply chain in the UK. The way we build stuff in StratCon is slightly different from the way we build stuff in the rest of the UK because we use UK contractors. Most of our contractors who do StratCon projects are compositions of different contractors who are willing to work in that bit of the world. And we don't get the same trade skills by far in StratCon projects than we do in UK projects. The quality is just taken that it'll be less in certain parts of the world because we have security issues. So there's loads of little nuances with StratCon projects you don't get in normal UK projects.
If I plan on using that contrast to my benefit, though, it won't hinder me if I don't specify a part of the world, if I just say across all defence estates?
It doesn't. You need to contextualise that in your introductory paragraph, why you're taking that approach.
Yeah.
And then highlighting the little differences, or the nuances within the estate. Okay, I'm not saying going into everything, but say, look, it's DI. The DIO estate is broken down into these agencies, and they're slightly managed in different ways.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Right, if you haven't got anything else, I'm sure you want to do something with your evenings as well. So what I'll do is I'll call it quits. I will. There's a couple of references just there for you. John Bingham has got some great literature on how to write a dissertation. Okay. If you're looking at doing experiments, Writing for Science and Engineering by Heather Sillen Roberts is a really good book on how to write your experiments. That's the video what will show you how to do statistics made easy. And I advise you all watch that video because he'll show you in 5 minutes how to do your statistical analysis for your reports. Okay. So if you haven't got any questions for me, we'll leave it there. I'll stop recording this and I'll put it on the system and send you all a link to it so you know where it is so you can refer back to it. And I wish you the best of your projects.
Wicked.